I don't know, Pete, if you noticed, I put a do not use sign up here. Because you know what? I knew you were going to sit there.
Thank you.
And I didn't want to spit on that. So I'm sure you're aware the weather is changing. And as we continue to move deeper into the autumn months, one of the things that I'm going to miss, beside the warm weather, beside the sunshine, is the opportunity to go on beach walks with my wife. Perhaps you're aware that our beach walks have been challenged this year because of the erosion that has taken place for what, probably the last couple of years. You know, the waves and the wind just pounding the shore. It's been going on at least since winter. And the erosion has dramatically altered our shoreline. There was a time when I would be able to walk the beach heading north, and I could go for miles and miles and miles. In fact, there was a period of time when it became kind of a little obsessive to see just how far. I knew that once we hit Douglas, we'd have to stop, but you know, to see how far that we can go. But for the past few years, you know, because of the higher water and because of the pounding waves, there's areas that it's really difficult to be able to get around unless, you know, you want to go out swimming in the lake, and that's not something that I chose to do, but it's drastically affected our beachfront. And speaking of waves and winds, there have been many times, right, this past summer, when some of the swimming conditions have been very dangerous. You know how it goes, despite warnings, despite the red flags, every year someone drowns as a result of carelessness or riptides. What a tragedy. I mean, so I live in the city, you know, and I think, oh, gosh, people pay money to come here to South Haven and vacation. And so, you know, you want to come and you get your rental and you get your beach stuff on and you head to our gorgeous beaches, you know, and you know things are going to be great. Water this year for the majority of the summer it's been in the 70s. It's just been fantastic. But you get to the beach and you find some place to be able to sit at the beach because they've been packed. And you notice there's red flags flying. And you look out over the water and you see the whitecaps and you think, wow, swimming can be a little bit dangerous. But that other part of you inside says, but how cool would it be going out and body surfing? And so the water just calls you, you know, it's almost too much of an adventure to turn down. And perhaps some of those thoughts had gone through individuals' minds, you know, as they chose to go swimming, even though red flags indicate that it's dangerous. But you came to have fun. And you came to South Haven for an adventure. And the unthinkable happens. Someone drowns. And that's not how vacations are supposed to go, are they? You arrive in town for fun, relaxation, and you go home devastated. What a tragedy. You know, such a thing happened to a 44-year-old Lakeville, Indiana man last July at Lions Park Beach in St. Joe. He had two of his kids out swimming in the water, 17 and 12. Surely 17 and 12-year-olds know how to swim, right? Should be able to swim pretty good. I don't know whether or not there were any warnings in effect. All I read was the 17-year-old and the 12-year-old were caught up in a riptide. And they were having difficulty making it back to shore. And apparently the father saw his children in distress and he swam out to rescue them. Both the 17-year-old and the 12-year-old were rescued by a St. Joe reserve officer. But the 44-year-old father drowned. I'm sure from that family's perspective, such a tragedy just doesn't make sense. Now, last Sunday I shared a message with you about trusting God. I mentioned how trusting God has at least 4 elements. I mentioned also how trusting in God has an object. It incorporates knowledge. It involves the head, And the heart involves action. If you are unable to participate in that service, you can find a recording of that message online at our website. Last week I also mentioned that as far as relationships go, trust is really put to the test in times of crisis. When things seem to be going really great and very smoothly, we don't have any problem trusting God. Yeah, God, you and I were like this. No problem. But when we're in the midst of some kind of adversity, then trust is challenged. When we face some kind of loss, like losing a loved one, trust is challenged. When circumstances cause us pain or pressure, trust is challenged. And when we diligently pray for God to answer prayer a certain way and God chooses not to, our trust is challenged. I want to talk about trust again this morning. You see, because building trust is a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. And for trust to increase in any relationship, you'll find that it's a continuous process. This especially holds true in our relationship with God, but here's the kicker. Trust is developed through trials and adversity. Most of us are familiar with the hymn, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." Did you ever hear that? Or is that new? I'm not going to sing it. Yes, thank you. You know the story behind that song that was written by Louise Steed? The story goes, it was a very beautiful sunny day, and Louisa and her husband and her daughter Lily decided to go for a picnic. And so they go picnicking on Long Island Sound. And while they're there enjoying the picnic, the Steeds heard a scream. It was coming from a young boy who was swimming and was going under. So Mr. Steed ran to the rescue. And Louisa and Lily watched helplessly as both Mr. Steed and the boy drowned. Probably no red flags, right? Such a tragedy must not have made much sense to Louisa, but her trials were not over. You see, because of the loss of her husband, she and her daughter became destitute, very poor. Yet she continued to trust in God, and she knew that God would never leave her. She come to find out that He provided for her and Lily, and as a result, she learned to trust God like never before. And she expressed those words of trust in her song, "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." I like happy endings. And eventually, Louisa and her daughter Lily moved to South Africa, where they became missionaries. You know, when we face trials and adversity, when crisis comes looming before us, we generally have three responses. Three responses. This doesn't make any sense. Do you ever feel that way? This doesn't seem fair. Or this doesn't seem very loving. Why do we respond along these lines? Well, when I thought about it, I believe it has to do with our need to know. Right? I mean, after all, if God's going to allow us to undergo some kind of trial, some kind of adversity, if He's going to allow us to face crisis in our lives, then don't we have a right to know what He's doing? Why He's allowing things to happen? And when we don't receive the answer we want, then we often feel our circumstances just don't seem to make sense. Or we view God as not being very fair. Or heaven forbid, we accuse God of not being very loving. Last week I talked about 4 pillars of trust, all based on God Himself. I talked about God's plan and God's principles, God's purposes and God's promises. So this morning I thought it's only right that I should share 4 more things with you, seeing things seem to be bundled in 4s. Let me refer to them as 4 levels. 4 levels of trust. And I want to look together with you at how these four levels develop based on the experience of an Old Testament patriarch, Abraham. If you know anything about Abraham, you would know that the majority of Abraham's life was engaged in the process of learning to trust God. God calls Abraham and tells him to leave his homeland and go to the country that he would lead him. To be able to do that, Abraham had to trust God. When some of his family members were taken captive by foreign kings, Abraham had to learn to trust God. When he feared that he would be killed and his wife would be taken from him, he had to trust God. And then God promised the impossible, that his wife would bear him a son. Even though it was physically impossible, Abraham had to trust God. The development of trust Abraham was developing was really accentuated nearly 4 decades after Isaac was born. And in Genesis chapter 22, God calls to Abraham. And after Abraham responds, God gives him a command that certainly would have caused the most stressful crisis Abraham has ever faced in his life. Notice verse 2. Then God said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Abraham waited for God to fulfill his promise for 25 years. That's a long wait. What do you think? 25 years. But God kept his promise. And now God tells his servant to offer him up as a burnt offering. Why, God? I mean, this certainly does not make sense. You made me wait for 25 years, you came through on your promise, and now you want me to offer him up as a burnt sacrifice? That's not very fair, and it surely is not an expression of a loving God. But early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. And he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac, and when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. The next morning, Abraham has this amazing response. He took the knowledge that he had developed about God over these many years, took it to heart, and then he took action. He saddles his donkey, cuts the wood for the fire, takes 2 of his servants, and sets out to the place where God wanted him to go. Doesn't that blow you away? For discussion purposes, let's say that this is level 1, okay, trust. And let's just call this level general acknowledgement. It's a trust that says, I might not understand God, but I know you do, so I'm going to trust you. I will take the first step. It's a fairly safe stage of trust that I'm sure all of us are capable of developing. It's a stage whereby we make some verbal declaration to God. I know, God, you've got things in control, and so I'm going to trust what you're doing. Not bad. I mean, we may even take some kind of action that gives weight to our verbal declaration. For Abraham, it may have said in his heart, God, I trust you, I know that you're in control. And as evidence of that trust, Abraham takes action. Saddles the donkey, cuts the wood, grabs 2 servants, and off they go to the place of God's leading. Oftentimes we can get to that level of trust. And so Abraham travels with his 2 servants for 3 days. I trust you, God. I trust you, God. I trust you, God. You're in control. I'm thankful you're in control. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Circumstances thrust Abraham, I think, into another level of trust. And so let's call this level 2. And let me refer to this level as applying trust to circumstances. See, for 3 days, this little group journeys, trusting God. For 3 days, their destination was like out there. Out there someplace. We're still on the road to that. But now it's no longer out there. Now they've arrived at their destination. And as Abraham looks up, he sees the place where he's going to have to carry out God's commands. I mean, I can imagine Abraham saying something like this to himself. I said I trust you, God. You've led me to this place. This is the place of your choosing. The place where I have to offer up my son as a burnt offering. And I'm not certain I really understand, but I'm going to trust you. And so he said to his servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. And we will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham arrives at the mountain. The hour's at hand. I can picture him maybe closing his eyes as he's trying to figure all this out. Maybe he says something like, here we go, God. I'm still going to trust you. And turning to his servants, he tells them to remain here with the donkey because he and his son are going a ways ahead. And they're going to worship. And when they're finished, they'll return. As I mentioned, most of us, if not all of us, are capable of making it to level 1, right? And making that acknowledgement. However, there are circumstances that require us at times to take our trust to a deeper level. Listen, it's one thing to saddle up the donkey, but it's another thing to arrive at the place of sacrifice. God, you led me to this place, the place of your choosing, the place where I have to offer up my son as a burnt offering. Here we go. I still trust you. What happens next in the narrative takes trust to an even greater. Let's call this level 3. And let's call this level building altars of sacrifice. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. And he himself carried the fire and the knife. I can't imagine what it must have been like at this point in their adventure. How difficult was that for Abraham? Each step the two of them took had to seem like it was an eternity. If I knew that my son was about to die, not 4, doesn't matter which one it would be, but if I knew one of my sons was about to die, the last thing that I'd want to do is take a bunch of wood and put it on his back. I want to grab a hold of them. I want to hold them tight. I never want to let them go. Never. Certain tears would have flowed from my eyes, so many that I would have had a hard time finding the fire and the knife. At this stage, I'm sure I probably would have said, that's it, God, I'm out of here. I can't do this. However, just as I'm not Abraham, Abraham's not me. And so the two of them went on together. What did they say as they walked? Did they talk? They have a conversation. I'm not told whether they did or not. I'm trying to put myself in their shoes. I think I might have been so overwhelmed, I would not have been able to utter a single word. What do you say? Silence can be deafening, right? Walking to the place where the deed would be done had to be excruciating. Each step must have posed a challenge to Abraham's trust. And then finally, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Oh, man. You look into those innocent, trusting eyes of your son, who you love more than life itself, and what do you say? You can't get emotional about it because you can't let him see weak eyes. Got to hold back the tears. Real men don't cry. Doesn't he realize that he's the lamb? Doesn't he know that he is the burnt offering? Doesn't he know that he is the one who is going to die? Okay, God, this does not make sense. And by the way, this is not very fair. And this certainly doesn't seem very loving. If you were Abraham, what do you say? Somewhere in Abraham's heart, he had to come to a place where he just said, "I still trust." And so Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When life throws some of its greatest challenges at us, it's one thing to say the right thing. And maybe that right thing might even sound pretty spiritual. But it's another thing to live out what you believe, to do what you say. Trust can be fragile. Fragile. It's something that we have to choose to do. It's not something that God gives us. By his grace, he gives us what? He gives us faith. You and I can't muster faith. You and I can't even muster enough faith that equates to a mustard seed. Faith can grow, and we can play an important role in the growth of faith. Belief increases our faith. However, the bottom line is still this: it's God who gives that increase. Trust is something that we do as a result of our faith. Trust is something, as I mentioned last week, that's awakened and practiced because we believe. Because of Abraham's faith in God, because of what he believed, he was able to say to his son, God himself will provide a lamb for the burnt offering. Don't worry about it. And they went on together. That kind of trust helped them get to the next level. I tell you, this account always humbles me, and it moves me when I read it. Because again, like Abraham, I have sons. Like Abraham, God's done some miraculous things in my life. He drew me to himself. He's guided for me. He's provided for me. Like Abraham, there are times when I took matters into my own hands. And when they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged wood on it. Abraham knew they had arrived in that place where he would have to sacrifice his son. And so he builds an altar, because after all, if you're going to offer up a sacrifice, you've got to offer it up on an altar. And whether the altar was made of dirt or whether it was made of stone, it didn't matter. It had to be overwhelming to build that altar, because he knew what would happen next. Listen, it is not easy to get to this level of trust, much less beyond it to the next level. I look at this and I think, this is hard for me. Hard. And maybe you feel the same. Yet Abraham didn't stop here. He went deeper. And Abraham took his trust to the ultimate level. Let's call that level 4. Let's refer to level 4 as sacrificing all. Don't fly by this too quickly. Put yourself in Abraham's shoes, will you? You build your altar. You arrange the wood on it. As you're putting log after log, you realize it's not some backyard bonfire. It's not some social event. We're not getting together to make and eat s'mores. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where you have to give your all. Abraham, you trust God in all things. And the answer had to be yes. So he bound his son Isaac and he laid him on the altar on top of the wood. I'm ready, Lord. I will trust you in all things. Listen, realize when Abraham did this, he was not required to offer up Isaac as a burnt offering, as a sin offering. God didn't give the law yet. This would come down years later. There was no sacrificial system in place here. This kind of offering was called a burnt offering because it reminded the individual that fire was going to consume the entire sacrifice. It wasn't a sacrifice for sin. At this point, it was a sacrifice of commitment. At this point, it was a sacrifice of surrender. At this point, it was a sacrifice of trust. It was a sacrifice that said, God, I trust you with everything. I trust you with everything in any and all areas of my life. Anything that hinders my trust in you, I want to place on this altar. May it be totally consumed so that nothing stands in the way of trust, not even a son of promise. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Abraham's trust had reached the point where he was willing to sacrifice everything, if that's what God wanted. Now, verses 11 through 14 show how God intervened, didn't allow Abraham to kill his son. And he tells Abraham, now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Now listen, don't think for a moment that God didn't already know the outcome of this event, because God's all-knowing. God didn't test Abraham so that he could see whether or not Abraham passed or failed, whether or not Abraham trusted him. God tested Abraham so that Abraham could see what kind of trust he had in God. Do you trust God? Do you really trust God? How much do you trust him? Do you trust him like on a level 1 where it's nice and safe? Where your commitment, your trust doesn't cost you too much? How much do you trust God? Again, I share 4 levels, right? General acknowledgement, yeah, I trust God. Come on. Apply your trust to circumstances. Trust him enough to build altars. You trust him enough to sacrifice all. To what degree are you willing to trust? Can you trust him to level 4? How would you know unless God brings about a situation where you need that kind of trust? It's my prayer that you will come to a place where you can confidently and truthfully say, God, I trust you in everything. In any and all areas of my life, I trust you. It's just so sweet. Trust in Jesus. As we spend time in prayer, I'd like you to pray along these lines. Would you pray, God, I trust you with everything. In any and all areas of my life. Anything that hinders me from trusting you, I lay on the altar. May it totally be consumed so that nothing stands in the way of trust. Not even, and you fill in the blank. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.